Welcome, everyone. My name is Kirsten James, and I'm the Senior Program Director of Water at Ceres. For those of you who may not know us at Ceres, we're a nonprofit organization working with influential investors and companies around a host of sustainability issues. I want to thank you all for joining us today, but quickly, before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that we are recording today's session, so you'll be able to revisit it after we've concluded. And also, we will be using the live chat function to submit questions throughout the panel. So feel free to do that, and we'll try our best to get to those at the end of the session. So earlier this week, in partnership with the Global Institute for Water Security and the Valuing Water Initiative, Ceres released the Global Assessment of Private Sector Impacts on Water. This new report reveals how industry practices are driving critical threats to global freshwater systems. In addition, the analysis provides a series of corporate actions and investor considerations to mitigate water risks while reducing the private sector's financial exposure. So in today's session, we'll provide an overview of the key findings of the report and some recommendations, followed by a panel discussion and a question and answer session. Our speakers today are all experts in water security, environmental risk, business, and financial policy. And specifically, the panel will be exploring the growing water crisis and how industry activities are impacting freshwater resources, how water impacts pose long-term financial risks to the business community, and then finally, core actions organizations and their investors can take to mitigate their respective financial risk. So I'd like to take just a quick minute to provide a bit of context as to how the global assessment fits into the larger picture. Ceres has been working with investors and companies on water risk issues for over a decade. We've really recognized the critical need to shift how our capital markets value water if there's really any chance of achieving a clean, accessible, and sustainable water supply for all. Some of our relevant work is showcased on this slide. Hopefully, many of you have explored our work over the years. But despite some great progress and notable inroads made during this time, we really see the water crisis proceeding at a real dizzying pace. So to amplify the work that we've been doing and are doing, and to further support investors engaging with companies on water sustainability, Ceres and our partners launched the Valuing Water Finance Initiative back in 2020. And the initiative is really designed to provide investors with the tools required to make the case to prioritize water risk and to successfully engage with corporate leaders on water. So the core elements of the work we've been doing and how we are approaching this are outlined on this slide. Core to this work, we've been partnering with key asset owners and managers and driving towards a collaborative investor initiative to really drive that large scale change in corporate water practices. But first, we're filling an important gap in the research to ensure investors are compelled to act and have the resources to act. And that brings us to today's discussion and the global assessment. So no doubt there's a plethora of scientific and academic research detailing the threat of the water crisis. However, in our view, it really isn't compiled or articulated in a way that resonates with the financial industry and can be a really useful tool for them. So we believe the global assessment fills this gap, shown in the second bubble on this slide, and will really help us on our journey to drive strategic investor action as we embark on this next phase of work. And really what we're after is building the momentum towards setting specific expectations for companies. And then as we launch the global investor engagement in the next few months, where investors will strive to drive large-scale change in corporate water practices. And of course, we couldn't have gotten to this stage of work without our Valuing Water Finance Task Force members shown here, who will hopefully continue to help us along the journey and guide this work. So with that context of why and how we arrived at this point and where we're going and hoping that it'll take us, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jay Falmonchetti, the principal investigator for this work. Jay is a professor of hydrology and the executive director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. And it's here where he holds the Canada 150 Research Chair in Hydrology and Remote Sensing. And before coming to this role, Jay served as the senior water scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So with that, Jay will help us really understand the key findings of the global assessment of private sector impacts on water. So over to you, Jay.
Thanks very much, Kirsten. Next slide, please, Joelle. So this is a slide that's based on a lot of the research that we've done over the past 25 years and using a NASA satellite called GRACE, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. And the colors in the back in this map show the places that are either losing water, shown in red, or gaining water, shown in blue over the last, it's really the last 20 years. This figure's been updated through 2022. It looks exactly the same. And you can see all the hot spots for places where ice is melting, places where groundwater is being depleted, places that are being impacted by climate change and changing extremes. And of course, those are having a huge impact on the water risk to industry. And that's without talking about water quality issues. Next slide, please, Joelle. So we know that industry, including agriculture, and agriculture comes up a lot because it's the biggest user of water. So food production, of course, is taking a big toll. Having widespread impacts on global freshwater systems, industries putting tremendous pressure on changes in water quantity, on water quality. There's ecosystem alterations. There's issues. There's social, ecological issues. There's cultural issues that are equally important. Next slide, please. And the implications financially are staggering. The risk, the water risk, is a real material risk. 50% of the industrial stocks held by the 4 major stock industries have a medium to high water risk. 4.2 trillion of economic activity is at risk due to water stress, and on and on. If you look over on the right side, 300 billion was reported in 2020 of the impacts of water risk, and that's expected to grow with some of the issues that we're reviewing today in the report. Next slide. Climate change isn't making any of this easier. It's a threat multiplier. It's putting additional stress. Maybe we were already withdrawing too much water for example, from groundwater systems. We were already doing a lot of contamination, and climate change just makes it worse. And as this quote here says, if carbon is the driver of climate change, water is the casualty. I like to say the water is the messenger that brings the information about climate change to your community, to your company, or to your front door. Next slide, please. So we undertook this scientific-based assessment of global water impacts, industrial impacts on water, and I have to say it's been one of the more rewarding 2-year periods in my career, being able to work with CERES and the CERES team, and to compile this information and to be able to share it with you with the hope of really having an impact. I mean, we really need your help because business as usual isn't really working. So you can see the different steps here shown as these different gears. We started off looking at literally like millions of papers. We did a lot of data analytics to get it down to step 3, where we could identify a tractable amount of papers that we could sort through and identify the sectors, the industries, extract the information, synthesize, and then share it in this report. Next slide, please. So here's what comes out, and these are the key sectors and the key industries. So you can see the usual suspects: food, beverage, textiles, oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, and so on. One of the interesting things about using this data mining approach, and we were focused on the academic literature and reports, but some things that you're not necessarily on the radar, maybe a little bit under the radar, got on the radar by doing this analysis. So, for example, battery manufacturing and even things like aquaculture, which I think we have a little bit in the appendix. Next slide, please, Joelle. So we have in the report, I hope it's very user-friendly, and then there's, Ceres also did some materiality briefs, but there's charts like this that help us understand, say, the industry on the left and the risk, the level of risk, and then we go into more detail. I mean, we're looking across the supply chain, and the life cycle, and color-coded there according to risk. And we go into more detail. Next slide, please, Joelle. So we can look at food products, we can look at the value chain, the practices, the externalities like nutrient runoff, right? Like water consumption. Then the impacts on fresh water, which you can see, right? Ecotoxicity, eutrophication, the hotspots. So hopefully this will be very useful for you. Next slide, please. And just to drill a little deeper, this is the kind of information that comes out of the report. And so just going into agriculture and food products a little more, agricultural food production is the leading driver of water degradation globally. And industries that rely extensively on ag supply chains are at higher risk than others. Food products is the largest driver of water consumption, water pollution, and other water-related impacts. It's also the second largest source of phosphorus, water pollution globally. So there are other, for the sectors, the various sectors, excuse me, other high-level summaries like this that hopefully can be very helpful for your discussions, that you investors are having with industry. Next slide, please. Another thing we did, so that, we looked by sector, but we also looked more holistically at just what are the critical threats, what's happening out there. We came up with 5 critical threats: eutrophication, groundwater depletion, metals contamination, plastic pollution, and water diversions. And the last one is a little bit more subtle and hasn't been on the radar so much, but water being diverted, the building of reservoirs, the displacement of people, so upstream users claiming water rights and those sorts of issues. And so we've got the impacts on the left, the description, and then the severity and the industries. Next slide, please. Let's skip over this one, just gives a little bit more detail. Next one, please, Joelle. So yeah, just going into these critical threats. So eutrophication, basically fertilizer runoff, growing plants in water bodies, and then using up all the oxygen, starving the, excuse me, just a second. Starving the water bodies of oxygen, and really a huge problem. You can see some of the industries there on the right side. Next slide, please. Groundwater depletion is something that I work on extensively, and it's, I think, really been overlooked by much of the world because there's not a lot of groundwater management going on all over the world, and it's a real problem because groundwater provides almost half the water for irrigation for food. So we need your help in getting industry involved in stewardship and sustainability of groundwater. Next slide, please. Metals contamination. You can see in the chart on the left the various metals that we're talking about. So lead, iron, zinc, arsenic, cadmium, and industries like semiconductors, which are booming. I was just in Phoenix, and that's a huge growth area, and that's problematic not only for the metals contamination, but also because there's not a lot of water there. But metals and mining, batteries, and high tech. Next slide, please. Plastic pollution, we hear a lot about this in the news, and it's really a tremendous problem. It's happening all over the world. Those dots really are representing the mouths of rivers, and so textiles, chemical industry, food products, this stuff is everywhere. I just saw some research that it's ending up now, of course, in human tissue. We should have anticipated that. It's all over the world. It's, on the ice sheets, and it's in our bodies. Next slide, please. In water diversions, I think one that really needs a little bit more attention because of the human cost and the human impacts, whether we're talking about displaced peoples or threats to livelihoods. This is a major issue, and it's happening all over the world, as you can see in this figure. There's also, I think, a lot of reputational risk associated with this. So next slide, please. Emerging threats, PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals. Well, they're forever unless you do something about them. And there are things, I've seen some recent research about how, and this is the sort of thing that investors could encourage industry to invest in, this sort of research to break down the PFAS into things that are not forever. So that's active research. Pharmaceuticals, of course, we know they're ending up in our waters, basically passing through our systems. And again, the social conflicts and justice also related to the diversion topic that I was just talking about. And so these are things that are really leading to, they're emerging threats, and we can get ahead of them, and we need your help to do that. Next slide, please. So we came up with some recommendations. I think we're going to end up with maybe 7 of these across a couple of slides before I turn it over to Kirsten. And so on the water quantity side, assessing, monitoring, mapping, engaging suppliers, reporting is just incredibly, we need transparent water reporting. Engaging suppliers, thinking up and down the supply chain. Water quality, understanding what your discharges are and acknowledging them and work to improving them, setting these robust targets. Ecosystem protection. Circular economy is amazing. And I mentioned the chip plants around Phoenix, and they're doing some circular things with water, or at least building towards it. And that could be very, very helpful. Access to wash, of course, water sanitation and hygiene. And so that involves collaboration within your basin, within your region, the region of the industry, the multi-stakeholder collaboration and supporting policy and investment. Next slide, please. Business integration is critically important. We would love to see formalizing board of director and senior management oversight of water management. It needs to be at that board level. Executives should be held accountable. This is right up there with carbon. I just wrote something, a blog post called "Water is the New Carbon," in a reporting sense, not in a greenhouse gas sense. Public policy engagement and water governance, so critical, especially in transboundary and groundwater issues, advocating for those policies that are this is in everyone's best interest. We have to sustain these water resources so we can have production of the goods and the services and the food and the energy that we all need to sustain ourselves. And finally, this multi-stakeholder collaboration issue comes back again. It's super important, especially at the regional level. We need to understand what's going on in these basins and in these watersheds, because they're becoming just increasingly more stressed, and there's really no way to accomplish the stewardship that we need from industry without that engagement. So again, we need your support on that. I think it could be time, Joelle, to hand it over to Kirsten. Okay, thanks everyone.
Great. Thanks so much for that overview, Jay. So I'm just going to briefly take a moment to draw out how we see some of this work as really important for the investor audience. So, first, the scientific case really is clear that industry impacts to water resources are severe and systemic. In conversations, this is sometimes, unfortunately, still a question. And I think this, report really drives home the fact that these impacts really are severe and systemic. So this should aid institutional investors who have that fiduciary duty to protect their financial value at risk to act and to engage with the companies that they own. In addition, the evidence pinpoints where investors should focus immediate attention to the sectors causing the most severe impacts for one, but also to the specific corporate actions and practices that are causing the most severe impacts. So really helping investors hone in on where they should focus their discussions and engagements with companies. And then fleshing this out just a tad further, a handful of thoughts, very related thoughts as to where this could also go in helping move the discussion and dialogue. So first, we hope the synthesis of the scientific evidence really helps raise awareness of institutional water impacts among investors. Second, identifying the impacts in sectors, as we said, and their associated industries that are causing the most harm and really have the most to lose is really critical baseline understanding to really target those engagements with companies. And as Jay pointed out too, collaboration really is key to mitigating water risk. For example, collaborating with academics, nonprofits, governments, and others to monitor, measure, and then address those water risks really is critical and is an important piece of the puzzle to advance sustainable water management. There's obviously tremendous value in applying the scientific evidence in many points of the decision-making process, investment practices to reduce impacts on water resources, for example, among many applications. And then transformation. We hope this sets the stage for transformation, where together we're really advancing large-scale change in corporate water practices and water-related financial risks. And our approach to doing so with many colleagues and many on the line today is through the Valiant Water Finance Initiative. So with that overview, I'd like to now transition to our panel discussion. So we've convened a set of leading experts today to really unpack the findings and the implications of this work a bit more deeply. So in addition to Jay, I'm joined by two additional colleagues. So first, I'd like to introduce California Controller Betty Yee. So Controller Yee is the Chief Fiscal Officer of the world's fifth largest economy, California, serving as chair of the Franchise Tax Board and as a member of the California Public Employees Retirement System and the California State Teachers Retirement System boards. She is also notably a founding member of the Valiant Water Finance Task Force. And then we're also joined by one of our scientific advisory committee members who fed insights into the report, Dr. Kate Brauman. And Kate serves currently as the Associate Director of the Global Water Security Center at the University of Alabama. And prior to this, for about 7 years, she was the lead scientist at the Global Water Initiative at the University of Minnesota. So thank you all so much for joining the conversation today. And Kate, I'm going to turn first to you. So I'm guessing you weren't too surprised, given your extensive background on water security issues. You weren't too surprised by the severity and the systemic nature of industry impacts to water resources that we brought forward in this report. But I'm curious, were there any sort of crucial findings or takeaways that you gleaned from this work and the scientific research that was compiled that really come to mind or that you can highlight for us?
I wasn't surprised, which is, I guess, unsurprising to me, but I think it is surprising probably to a lot of the folks who are on this call. And I think one of the most powerful things about this report is how it highlights the individual sectors, but also the interlinkages. Because a huge part of what we see is that the stresses and the water-related both impacts to companies and from companies connect to everyone. Water really is a system. This report highlights that, and I really appreciate that. What I have often said is everybody is downstream of someone. And particularly as we think about sector-wide and also economy-wide impacts, every facility is downstream of some other facility. And so from an investor perspective, there's this amazing point of leverage to think about how can we make this whole system better. And that's really where the impacts are going to happen. As much as at an individual facility level, there's lots we can do. And that's another piece that I really appreciated about this report is that there is a big focus on what do we do? That we have to actually do something about this. We can't just describe the problem. We need to take action and move forward. And, there is all this science out there. I've been looking at it for decades. Jay's been looking at it for decades. We know it's there. And I have never met a scientist, particularly in the water sector, who doesn't start out their paper saying, this is decision relevant. And yet we need Ceres. We need the Global Institute for Water Security. We need the Global Water Security Center to translate that science into actionable information for companies, for the security sector, for everybody who wants to do something about this. And so I'm just delighted to see this report out in the world.
Great. Yeah, those connections you mentioned really are important to think about. And I think that also speaks to the collaboration that's really necessary among many different stakeholders in order to solve the water crisis. So, taking that a step further, Kate, were there any industries or critical and emerging threats highlighted in the report that, really stood out to you as, or maybe in your current research, you could tie in some of that work that, you're really concerned about or, you find particularly notable or interesting?
So a lot of my work has been focused on agriculture. And as you and Jay pointed out at the beginning, we know globally about 70% of water withdrawals are for agriculture, closer to 90% of water consumption is for agriculture. And so we really need to focus on what's happening on fields. And there's some great research that's happening on that from an investor perspective, from a sector and company perspective. There's often a big disconnect between what happens on fields and even what we know about the corn or the lettuce or the flour that ends up as an input into manufacturing food and beverages. And so really getting a tighter connection and understanding what that connection is, I think is something that's really exciting in the science that has real implications for the management. So can I actually source from a more water secure place? Or can I build a supply chain that's more flexible so that when someplace has a lower yield because of a drought year, or there's some kind of an impact because of a flood, it's not catastrophic. Instead, there's flexibility in the supply chain, and we can actually use that as a mechanism, as a system level mechanism to start being more water wise in terms of our agricultural production.
Yeah, no, those insights into the egg supply chain are really critical. And I'll put in a plug for a series report called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, where we do sort of explore what companies are doing broadly on water management, but also, specifically within the agricultural supply chain. And so it's a good resource for companies and investors to sort of understand best practices in the supply chain. So Jay, I want to come over to you and sort of ask a similar line of questioning. So, in conducting this research and this assessment, anything that was surprising or perhaps, as Kate said, particularly confirming?
Well, tremendous confirmation, of course. I guess if there is, it's not surprising, but it is, I think, the first time that the industry impacts have been assembled like this. And so I think the impact is in the collective understanding, the synthesis that comes out of this. We also don't talk together in the same conversation. We often don't talk about water quantity and water quality together. And so that's important. I think the fact that we were able to not only go sector by sector, but look across, like cross-cutting ideas, cross-cutting themes of problems, right? Groundwater depletion, social justice issues, eutrophication, I think was really, really important. So yeah, I mean, Kate and I have been in this business for a long time. And I think, she probably, or, we probably both agree that the science is out there and now we need help getting it. We can try policy things and those things are happening, but we need the investor push to really make it. We're not going to move the needle on global water security without industry engagement. And a lot of that is actually the food industry.
Yep, critical point there, definitely. So, one as Ceres was sort of flushing out, this Valuing Water Finance Initiative and sort of the research and core work that was really needed to set the foundation, before widespread action probably could take place. We really recognize on the climate side, there's a lot of terrific science that's been, compiled, and, the IPCC, again, it just released a new assessment last week, reinforcing that climate is a threat multiplier and that our window to act is really closing rapidly. And so, a lot of media attention, a lot of buzz around a lot of the IPCC reports, rightly so. So I'm wondering, from the water perspective and looking at the global assessment, how do you see, the global assessment fitting in or perhaps complementing some of the climate impact findings and assessment in reports such as this latest IPCC report, and, linking it to the water risks? How do you see sort of these all tying together?
Yeah, so I see it as a continuation. And so, you had that figure, which I liked a lot, that had sort of like the bubbles getting bigger, right? And, you can think of that as momentum, or you can think of that as amplification. But there has to be a pathway. So even with IPCC, you can't just, we have to do more than just put out a report that says, here's we're all going to die. And it's really important then to take that information, in this case on water, translate it, start to make recommendations for industry. Now Ceres is going to pick up the ball and work with investors. We have to have that. We have to have that pathway to sustainability. So that's what I think this report, is an important cog in that pathway.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Controller Yee, turning to you, the Valuing Water Finance Task Force, which you're a part of, helped to inform the scope of this work, and you and your peers are a main audience for the report as well. So I'm curious, with that hat on as a Valuing Water Finance Task Force member, why do you see building a robust and scientific evidence base for the investor audience important? And, in addition to that, why do you think it has been historically hard for investors to really connect the dots to how the damaging impacts from industries pose long-term financial risks to our water because of these water resource impacts?
All right. No, thank you, Kirsten. And thank you to Jay and Kate for the tremendous work. And I just have to say, I'm excited to have this tremendous tool to move forward with. And, when I became a founding member of the Valuing Water Finance Task Force about 2 years ago, it really was with the belief that, for investors, this risk of water needs to be much more front and center. And look, I'm from California, so we're kind of ground zero for all water risks. And, just to see it before our very eyes and to know that, if we're not going to address this, that this really will have significant implications. And I think as what's been laid out, the numbers really speak for themselves, right? And so as I look at the nearly 800 companies that reported to CDP in 2018, $39 billion in water-related financial losses, and it keeps growing every single year. 50% or more of the stocks and that are listed in each of the 4 major stock indices fall within industries with medium to high water risk. And so as investors, we've made some progress in terms of measuring physical and financial transitional risks in our portfolios related to climate risk, but water has just not had the same uptake. And yet we see just how critical these risks are. Many of the largest institutional investors, and I would include CalPERS and CalSTRS in this until much more recently, are unaware of the widespread existing and emerging impacts of corporate practices on fresh water. And they're due to several causes. And I think the report really has been a great I hope it is really embraced broadly in terms of just giving us a common understanding of the causes. We know at the state and federal levels and even at the local levels, there really are not a lot of policies that are governing water use and quality. In California, we do have some strong laws, but really until very recently, we weren't really doing much relative to groundwater monitoring in our Central Valley and in our agricultural communities. And so when we have kind of a lack of these supervisory rules, it just means less accountability in terms of what the private sector risks are. And so we've undervalued, really what is happening here with water. The global economy continues to treat water as if it's infinite and lacks monetary value. And so there's always the old adage that if we're not measuring what we are, what's before us, that we're probably not managing it well. So if we're misvaluing water, we're bound to be mismanaging it. And so these are the factors I think investors need to keep in mind. And the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, I think, is really changing the dynamic, because not only is it helping to build the business case, but now we have the scientific case. And that is a huge, powerful tool in the arsenal of investors, I believe, to clearly demonstrate the risk. And so with now the clear scientific base and the global assessment, investors, I think, really have the ability to make the case as to why we need to act, and also just to start to have these engagements be very, very robust. And I too, Kate, really appreciate the action focus on this as well. It's one thing to just have the evidence and the facts, but it's now really time to act. When we talk about water as a crisis, it is a crisis, but the risks are being felt more and more every day.
Great. Well, thank you for those points. Hopefully, as you say, the report really can raise that, level of awareness in the investor community that is so needed. So definitely agree there. And Kate, over to you. I'm curious, as we talk about the action piece and how important, obviously, that is. I'm curious from a scientist's point of view, where should the private sector focus its attention to reduce water risk? You mentioned some of the supply chain pieces there. Are there certain practices, geographies, basins that we should be focusing on? How do we, get to that level of granularity, and how can the private sector be an effective stakeholder in helping solve the water crisis?
Well, I think you've just hit on one of the hardest things about water. And one of the reasons why I suspect that it's often been ignored is that it is both so local and big scale. So, in terms of what do you do? I mean, at some level, you have to do something in a facility you own. And so that's reducing your demand and throughput of water, and that's reducing what you put into the water. But what does that mean? Well, it really depends on where you are and what you're manufacturing and what your processes are. And you need an expert to really work on that with you. What we do know is that, especially over the long term, almost all of those investments are good investments financially. Particularly actually with water throughput, you're probably in any kind of manufacturing facility, you're spending a lot of energy to clean that water, to heat that water, to move that water around, in addition to whatever you're paying at the front gate. And so there's a lot of opportunity actually for immediate savings just from that kind of conservation. But sort of bigger scale, and this is, I think, especially where investors who have more of a systems perspective can be effective, is that you begin to see, throughout your supply chain, where are there really water sensitive pieces of the puzzle that you might be able to change? So one of the things that there's attention to in the report, and that I'm hearing more and more people talk about, are rare earth minerals. And both the enormous amount of water that's required when you're extracting them, but also the enormous risk to water quality in the process of extracting them. And so there's many, many, many industries and sectors where that feeds into your microchips or your batteries, or, it might just be a tiny little part, but if you didn't have it, it would be a big problem. And if you're not thinking about the water implications of that, then whatever it is that you are producing could really be compromised. And so I think that pressure and thinking in the longer term of what are all the inputs and how do we make sure that all of those inputs to what we're making are water secure, that's going to have a big impact on the water situation at a large scale.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I think, you know, as Ceres and our partners head into those company engagements, those kinds of considerations are really critical. And one thing I really valued in the report is for each sector and each industry, you know, the report sort of breaks it up into the value chain and sort of where along the value chain, you know, you do sort of start seeing those larger impacts and sort of connecting the dots there. So I think those will be sort of useful tools to get to some of your points as well. So Jay, I wanted to turn back to you. The report speaks to emerging threats and some emergency industries of note. And, you know, I was just reading an article earlier this week about PFAS and how, you know, it's, you know, they're everywhere and how can we, you know, ever think to get those under control. And I know you spoke earlier about some green chemistry initiatives and what have you, but you know, I'm wondering if you can share, you know, any of the emerging threats that really called out to you. Maybe all of them did, but any sort of words of caution or things to consider with these, you know, potential industries that we're really seeing, you know, blow up, so to speak, in the water world.
So I think the one that has probably received the least amount of attention is the social justice side, right? And so this has to do with displacing peoples, environmental racism, the things that happen with water diversion that kind of get swept under the rug. Maybe they're happening at a government level, but they're very important within the basins in which industry facilities operate. And so shining a light on that, I mean, there's so much in this report, and just listening to Betty and to Kate speak and highlight like what stood out to them. So super rewarding for me, but also makes me realize like, this is another one of those reports that has an awful lot of stuff in it. So there's a lot of room to amplify, and we'll probably be doing that over the next couple of years, to amplify some of the different parts here of the report. So the social justice one is one that hasn't received enough attention, right? And so Kate was saying, well, everybody, you know, everyone's upstream of someone or everyone's downstream of someone, and it's the downstream people that you know, usually get in trouble or, you know, suffer the consequences. And that happens collectively along a river, until you get to the end of the river, and you know, things can be pretty hairy there. It's also true. So the downstream analogy I think is great for surface water, but it's also true with groundwater too. And so like if you are, you know, living above an aquifer, so it's not necessarily downstream, but as the water table drops, you know, it's really only the bigger companies, the wealthier companies and wealthier individuals that can afford to dig the deeper wells. And so those people are getting left behind as well. So to me that, you know, we know about PFAS, I mentioned some research, you know, we know about pharmaceuticals, but it's the social justice part that I really want to emphasize.
That's a great, important point, Jay. Thank you for bringing that up. And I want to remind the audience, please use the chat feature. We'll be turning to audience Q&A fairly soon. But first, I want to turn back to you, Betty, and again, sort of talk about sort of some of the next steps from the investor perspective. So, you know, Ceres, obviously in collaboration with the Valley Water Finance Task Force and other stakeholders, have really been drawing from this science and drawing from the global assessment to develop a set of corporate expectations for Valley Water, sort of a framework for investors to use, you know, going into these dialogues and conversations with companies. So Betty, I'm curious, how do you think the expectations or this framework will really help to move the dial on private sector progress on water issues?
Yeah, great question. In some ways, I think we have, with this global assessment and now with the corporate expectations, we've developed a little bit of a synergy now about how to move forward. There is, like I like to refer to what the engagement we're going to be embarking on as the Climate Action 100 Plus for water, right? And which has really seen some successes, but the corporate expectations really are critical to certainly equip investors like CalPERS and CalSTRS and many others around the world with, just the framework, with which we are going to engage with companies and just pinpoint the areas that need improvement. This is the beauty of this report is that we have, just kind of points of accountability as we are talking to companies. And so I always like being armed with that when, we are coming in and really having these engagements. And on the climate side, investors, have been setting expectations around aligning with the Paris Agreement, meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And in some ways, the corporate expectations for valuing water are serving as guideposts for water. And so I think what is also the beauty of the corporate expectations is that it isn't necessarily anything new. This is kind of aligned with what has already been articulated by the UN Global Compact CEO Sustainable Development Goal for water. And so I think companies are very mindful of that. And the global assessment essentially just provides a clear path and story for the investment community about the risks of water management. And when we look at that in relationship to the corporate expectations, I think investors finally have at our fingertips the guidance that we need to hold companies accountable. So, I serve as California's controller. Accountability is my business, and I'm just really excited about this.
Great points, Betty. Thank you. And then in this next phase of work that you mentioned, as we turn to the investor engagement phase, so investors dialoguing and urging companies to move on these issues, can you talk about how this science and how the global assessment work can and should feed into those engagements?
Absolutely. I will tell you my hope, and I think it will happen because we have this powerful tool now, and that is that we look at really across the globe a number of powerful investor advocates on water. Some of this work has started. I can say that at CalPERS, we've been looking at water scarcity for a long time. And this is the thing, we do really need to act now. As I look at the work at CalPERS, as we've looked at water scarcity, we've had to layer that on top of just the physical risks of climate change. And so we have accumulated risk that will continue until we really begin to get our arms around, what we do about water risk. And so as we've seen in Climate Action 100 Plus on the climate side, investors have a tremendous opportunity to motivate companies to address these critical issues. And the science, as outlined in the global assessment, will help investors hone in on the industries causing the most severe and systemic impacts to water resources. And so just the fact that we're not kind of shooting blindly at a dartboard, that we can pinpoint this to where we see the specific practices that need to change to help us ensure sustainable water supply. That's powerful because we're not just going in and engaging on a general broad level, but that we are really pinpointing specifics about how we can build a more sustainable water future.
Great points. Thank you. And so with that, I am going to open it up to sort of the questions we've been getting from the audience. So we've had a lot coming in. I'm trying to sift through those as we speak. But let's see. The first one, maybe I'll open it up for either Jay or Kate or both. An audience member is curious, of the 7 sectors identified, where do you think companies and investors should really focus in on their efforts to mitigate water risk and support water-related opportunities? Kate, I know you talked about sort of agriculture and that keeps coming up, but any sort of advice you can give on sort of where to focus within that focus? Kate or Jay, any thoughts?
So I thought you had asked Kate.
Oh, sorry. Either, yeah.
Yes, and one of the things that's very clear about what the global assessment has to say is that nobody's in the clear, or at least nobody is definitionally in the clear because of the sector that they're in. And so we know that within all of these sectors, there are folks who are doing a fantastic job. They're, really managing water in smart, thoughtful ways, but that's not true everywhere. If I was starting with a really diverse portfolio, I would probably start with agriculture because of the water quantity issues. But in terms of the water quality issues, that's really where I would start thinking about, pharmaceuticals, mining, rare earth minerals, some of the real nasty nasties. But there's no free lunch with this anymore. We've looked at water as being, the old engineering adage was the solution to pollution is dilution, and we have learned that doesn't actually work very well when there's a lot of us and we're making lots of things. So there are places I would start, but I would really look throughout a whole portfolio. I don't think there's a free lunch anymore.
Great points. All right. So another question came in, and Betty, I think I'll let you try to take a shot at this one. So water risks often disproportionately affect minority, underserved, and or marginalized communities. What do you feel are investors' roles in addressing these impacts, and how can we accomplish this?
Sure. No, thank you. And I'm happy we're putting a focus on this. It is, as Jay said, sometimes the issue that takes a backseat when we're talking about these risks. And particularly as we've talked about water diversion today. I mean, I think that is one that has just been so understated over the past, and looking at the disproportionate use of water resources and the overdraft of groundwater. I mean, I look at this just even here in California, to bring it locally, about what is happening in terms of displacement of communities in our Central Valley, the agricultural capital of California and the United States. And so it's playing out here where we have over 1 million people who lack access to safe drinking water, mostly located in the Central Valley. So the water risk, including the community impacts and the associated reputational risk, this has to be part of what we measure, part of what gets disclosed, and part of what gets mitigated by companies in which we invest. And so I just hope that investors can begin and knowing that there are lots of tools available to help with this effort. And I do want to just highlight some of the available tools and metrics, such as the Ceres Water Hub and the Ceres Investor Water Toolkit. And then, of course, the corporate expectations, which will really hone in on just some of these issues. I think it's also important that just connecting with other like-minded investors. There is work that has begun. And so this is not starting from scratch, and to the extent that we can be collaborative in our approach to this, I think can be also helpful. And I also believe that as we move forward, it's really important for investors to speak with one voice. And this will really help accelerate the change that we need to see take hold. And so we have all the elements available to us. And I really do hope that this focus on particularly disproportionately affected communities and what we are seeing just happening in communities across the globe before our eyes just becomes incorporated in terms of how we assess the impacts for water generally.
Great, thank you. And Jay, I might turn to you first for this next question, but others feel free to chime in as well. And this sort of gets to one discussion point earlier, but the question asks or comments that the IPCC, has really helped create a buzz around the severity of climate impacts and been very successful at sort of elevating those issues. What can we do, for the water crisis to sort of match that level? How can we, get these findings and from the global assessment out there in the universe and people really starting to pay attention that's needed?
Well, so Kirsten, this has been, I don't want to say it's the bane of my existence, but it's really a huge challenge. And I've been working on the communication side for a long time. And, Betty, I worked tirelessly, in California, and, really distressed to see that even though we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, so some of our research is showing that groundwater depletion is actually accelerating right now. So the communication part is so key, and we can't really drop the ball on that. But how we do that, where do we go from here, I think is really an important, like, how are we going to, so we've got, a number of people on this webinar, which is great. But like, what are the other communication steps that we can take? So, and I'm specifically thinking now about the report and getting the information about the report more so into the hands of investors, letting them know around the world that this report is out there, that there are, actionable bits here, that there are tools. And I'm just going to shrug my shoulders and say, I try everything, but in this case, we should be strategic about how we get that information out there. What are the seminars we're going to give? What are the meetings we're going to go to? For example, tomorrow, I'm going to Singapore International Water Week, and talking about this report was not even on my radar. And for various reasons, wasn't on my radar. And part of that has to do with when we applied to go, and right, what we're going to talk about now. We are going to be going to World Water Week in Stockholm and talking about this report. So strategically thinking about how we socialize this information and communicate. And I guess what I'm saying is we can't drop the ball. It does not end here. It has to go on for several months.
Yeah, and I'd say also defining those new audiences, right? World Water Week, a lot of those folks are well aware, but we need to get out there to new audiences and really elevate the issue as well. Great. So Kate, maybe I'll pass this one to you for any thoughts, but we talked a lot about collaborations and how, we need many stakeholders collaborating in order to make the change that we're after. So curious, do you have thoughts on, are there places where the private sector really should be working together? And, maybe there are some things that, a company should be sort of focusing on its own, but there could be definitely a lot of ripe collaborative opportunities. Any sort of thoughts there?
I think collaboration is absolutely critical, and that companies have to be engaged in this. When we think about what are we using water, it's all getting funneled, almost entirely getting funneled through private companies, and investors have a say in that. So when we think about, how do we get together and make decisions about how we're going to divide or allocate limited water resources, we need companies, and therefore we need investors at the table. And so sometimes that's, sometimes that's very local. Sometimes that's a local planning process or a watershed scale planning process. But I think the shove to get everybody to that table and to engage in a forward-looking way has to come from, all the way throughout the business chain. There has to be interest in that that's shared by everyone, and that's shared because the recognition that none of us are going to be able to keep doing what we want to do, whether that's growing crops or making microchips or mining rare earth minerals, unless we are actually collaborating and have a shared understanding about how water is going to be used and how we're going to manage it.
Great points. Well, we are nearing our time, but for this last question, I'm going to combine a few questions that have come in and maybe turn to you, Betty, first, and then I can follow up. But the audience member was curious, sort of where do investors go from here? What are sort of the next steps for investors listening in who are called to action from this report, and how do they best engage?
Absolutely. Well, first, I think investors themselves need to elevate awareness of this crisis and risk. For a long time, and I'm not the most patient person when it comes to this, but I will say we don't have the luxury of dealing with climate change and then addressing water. And this is where, time is of the essence. And so to really have investors really bone up on the awareness of this global crisis and to then look at their own portfolios, to look at the existing just networks and engagement collaboratives that are out there, particularly Climate Action 100 Plus. I'm hopeful that this can be something that can be incorporated into that global engagement, because establishing a new one, I just don't think we have the time and luxury to do that. So obviously increasing awareness. Secondly, looking at where there can be already collaboration with those investors that have already begun this work. No one needs to start, new in terms of this work. And then thirdly, I think to Jay's point, because I do think we have to tackle this at both ends, and that is, how do we begin to elevate the attention to this? And certainly as a global community of investors, we can do that and we'll continue to do that. And I certainly will be a part of that. But it's also really looking at the lived experiences of what happens when we are going to not address this risk. And we see so many examples of that already globally. And so continuing to make the case for that this is a risk that is growing every day, and that for investors is not just sufficient to kind of sit and wait to see what will happen, but that when you look at your own portfolios, those industries that are water intensive, that we are thinking about how we are doing our part to reduce that risk and to create a sustainable water future.
No, that's a terrific last call to action, Betty. And I will say for those investors on the line who would like to join us in the Valuing Water Finance Initiative as we move into the engagement phase, we'll be launching that phase in about a month's time. So we hope you all will join us, and please connect with Ceres if that's of interest. And we need a large tent of investors to tackle this crisis that we're facing and in now. So we need more investors under that tent. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our terrific panelists. We hope you explore the report in detail and find it as useful as a resource as we do, and more to come. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.